to the Disc Golf Doctor. Today we're going to expand upon one of the ideas we brought up in the last video having to do with shoulder injury prevention. Have some good exercises for you today and enjoy.
Today we're going over scapular stabilization. Last time we talked about shoulder injury prevention. It was one of the topics we discussed. I want to go more in depth, and I want to go over a few exercises that really target the correct muscles that we want to get at. Realize that we're taking a huge amount of information, trying to boil it down to a few ideas that are most pertinent. There's a lot of debate amongst practitioners and within the research as to the best way to approach things, but I try to take the most scientific information and the best studies and bring it to bear on what we're going to talk about. There's some really great resources out there. I'm going to put one link to a video I was watching earlier today that talked about some stretching ideas before doing some of these exercises. I thought they brought up some good points. Later in the video, when they went over some exercises, he had some good cueing ideas. So take that for what it is. One piece of information I took from is a guy named Mike Reinold, who's used to be the head PT for the Red Sox for many years. He's really good with putting out great information on throwing sports in particular. So I took some information for some of his videos, and he came out with a study recently with Kevin Wilk and one other person that discussed our current understanding of the way the rotator cuff muscles and parascapular muscles function and what exercises target them best. So that's where some of the information came from, not all of it, but a portion of it.
A couple of simple points we want to make before we get into the exercises. We're really going to try to target the serratus anterior and the lower trap for a couple of reasons. First off, they're typically weak in people, and they've been shown to be weak, specifically in those that end up having shoulder issues and dysfunction. So we want to improve the ratio of strength with those muscles in relation to some of the other ones, such as the upper trap. Functionally, they're really important because they do several different roles. They help hold the inferior border of the scapula flush against the thoracic spine. You'll see this in many people when they're doing motions, that the inferior border will pop out away from their thoracic spine, called winging. And that can also be caused in part because of the increased thoracic kyphosis and the weakness of those muscles as well. So we want to strengthen those muscles to help hold the scapula flush against the thoracic spine. We want to strengthen them so that they can upwardly rotate the scapula. Many people are limited in that motion, and that gives people a lot of trouble when they're raising their arm up, because that should happen concomitantly with shoulder flexion or abduction. And they also help with scapular external rotation, which is a motion in which the scapula kind of rotates outwardly so that you can do things like horizontal abduction, which is essential for being able to throw a disc. So all those things we're going to try to improve by strengthening these muscles. And one thing I'm going to constantly point out is that these exercises are not about getting from point A to point B. It's how you do it. There's many, many people that can do this exercise and don't do it correctly. We talk about this all the time when we're discussing core strengthening with people. Many people have good abdominal strength. They might work on those muscles all the time, but they're not training the abdominal muscles to stabilize their spine, which is their role. So it doesn't matter how strong the muscles are if you can't utilize them functionally to do what they're designed to do. So even if you, say, have strong serratus anterior and lower trap, but it's not functioning properly, it's not actually stabilizing the scapula, it's not upwardly rotating the scapula, and it's not eccentrically controlling it, then it doesn't really matter. So when we go over the exercises, we're going to really talk about how do you want to do it properly so that you're engaging those muscles and actually training them effectively. First exercise I'm doing is shoulder protraction. I have a TheraTube with handles on it, but you can do it with TheraBand just as easily. I'm trying to kind of punch my hands forward. I'm imagining like I'm trying to give someone a hug, wrapping my arms around that way by rolling my shoulder blades forward. I'm keeping my elbows at a similar angle all the way throughout, and I'm trying not to round my upper back too much. I'm trying to get that motion in your shoulders. It's going to directly strengthen the serratus anterior so that we can have good strength before we start doing stabilization. This exercise is very similar. I'm stepping on some TheraBand here. I'm going to round my shoulders similar to how I was doing it on the previous exercise, but I'm going up at about a 120-degree angle in relation to my spine. The reason for this is some studies indicate that 120-degree angle gets somewhat better firing of the serratus anterior muscle as we're coming forward. Here's the first exercise that we're combining with rotator cuff strengthening. So we're doing external rotation, which is going to target the infraspinatus in the rotator cuff, which is typically weak. And we're also going to be retracting the shoulders. That means kind of pinching your shoulder blades together, and we're trying to do a posterior tilt, meaning really kind of tip your shoulder blades back so that inferior border, the lower border, ends up being more flush with your spine as you're coming back and really getting that motion in your back as well as your shoulders. Here are two exercises, one that we've gone over before, which is a combination of retraction, shoulder, external rotation. It shows very good muscle activation in the studies where you're doing this retraction. I'm pinching my shoulder blade and then I'm rotating my arm up. What you find is if you don't pinch that shoulder blade and really use those muscles, it'll be uncomfortable because the mechanics will be off, which makes perfect sense. So I'm retracting my shoulder, trying to pinch my shoulder blade, and then doing external rotation. So we get rotator cuff functioning, we get scapular activation as well as we're doing this exercise. And that's what a lot of the exercises just are designed to do. We're giving you resistance that's essentially forcing some of those scapular muscles to work as long as you're doing them correctly. Here's an exercise called Y's. You'll see why in a moment. I'm bringing my hands up and out to the side, and I'm trying to pinch my shoulder blades as I come up. I should probably be a little bit higher than I am there because you want it to, your arms to go right in line with the fibers of the lower trap. That's what muscle we're trying to target here. Really pinch your shoulder blades, otherwise it's going to hurt. You got to make sure that the exercise is totally pain-free. Otherwise it's not going to be helpful and it's going to aggravate your shoulder. This is a fairly simple exercise that's going to get you to activate some of those scapular muscles just holding a static position. We can also bring the arms up into shoulder flexion while keeping those shoulders pinched. This is going to turn into a more dynamic exercise down the road, but this is a basic one to encourage the scapular activation with shoulder flexion. This one's very similar to the one we did laying on our stomachs a moment ago. It's going to combine shoulder retraction with shoulder external rotation. So we're getting both the rotator cuff and the scapular stabilization muscles involved. A lot of patients, I like this more because some people, when they're laying on their stomach, particularly if they don't have great thoracic mobility, will have that shoulder too far protracted and therefore will be limited in shoulder external rotation. And it'll be uncomfortable and they just won't have sufficient motion to be able to do the exercise. So in this kneeling position, we can keep the thoracic spine in more extension, and oftentimes it can be better. I'm really trying to pinch my shoulder blade as I'm coming back and then into external rotation, holding that. One thing I really want to point out, and this goes for all the exercises, is I'm controlling not only when I'm bringing my arm back and my hand back, but I'm also trying to engage those muscles as I'm bringing my hand back down and then bringing my arm forward. That's absolutely critical. That's the motor control we're looking for, not only to be able to activate it, but to control it when we're doing the eccentric portion of the motion. This exercise is a little more sport specific. This is a motion necessary for throwing the disc, is we're going into what's called horizontal abduction. As we're doing that, I'm trying to keep my shoulder blade pinched so that I'm activating those muscles, holding my scapula a little more flush against my thoracic spine, going back and forth. These next two exercises are a little bit different. They're what you would call closed chain exercises, meaning the distal end, the far end of the extremity, is in a fixed position. Here I'm doing what's called a push-up with the plus. This is a slightly more advanced way of doing it with an unstable surface. I wouldn't start there, but it's an example of progression. I'm doing the push-up, and then I'm rounding my shoulders. That's what the plus part means. I'm doing the shoulder protraction, just like we talked about with that first exercise. I'm rounding the shoulders. You can do it just on normal ground, which is a great way to do it. Oftentimes we'll start people at an angle, putting their hands up against a countertop or table. And that'll directly affect how much activation of the muscle is required to do that motion. Find out what works best for you. Sometimes we start a little bit easier and then progress harder, obviously. But I'm keeping my stomach muscles tight, so I'm keeping my lower back in a flattened position with a posterior pelvic tilt, coming up and down, trying to engage those scapular muscles and round out the shoulders at the top. This next one is called the bear crawl. All right, you can do it either on your feet or on your knees. I'm trying to keep the muscles around my scapula engaged as I'm going forward and back. Both directions are important. In fact, in some ways, going backwards is even more important than going forward. Again, here's the example of me doing it on my knees. But you got to keep those muscles around the scapula engaged, pinching your shoulder blade as you're doing that to create some stability. You could also go laterally like I am going here. You could really go at any different angle. In summary, we're trying to strengthen a lot of different muscles here, but particularly the serratus anterior and lower trap. The exercises we're doing will engage many muscles in addition to that, but that's the focus. We're trying to make sure you're engaging those muscles around the scapula to do the exercise. If you're not doing that, you're not really gaining much out of it in the end. In fact, you're probably reinforcing poor motor control in the end. One very important to think about with basically all of the exercises is not only controlling the portion of the motion where you're doing what you would typically think is kind of the active phase, the muscle shortening component of things, but also when you're returning your arm back to that starting position, you need to control that. That's a lot of how muscles work and function, is controlling both directions. With a lot of these shoulder exercises, we always want to work on endurance. That's high sets and reps for a large volume, or you could lengthen the holds at the end of positions. You could modify it in that way to work on the endurance and lessen the sets and reps ultimately. As with all exercises that we do, make sure they're pain-free. If you can't find a way to modify the exercise and make it pain-free, don't do it at all. Focus on some of the other ones at that point. On the Disc Golf Doctor. As usual, please like and subscribe the video. Also, please leave any suggestions, thoughts, ideas going forward. I'm always open to them. Thanks.